Our speaker today is author David Maraniss. For many of us, that does not require an introduction. Nevertheless, for others, David Maraniss is associate editor at the Washington Post and a distinguished visiting professor at Vanderbilt University. He has won 2 Pulitzer prizes for journalism and was a finalist 3 other times. Although this is the 8th time he has addressed us, between his visits, we are able to enjoy his books many times over. His books are engaging, insightful, and enlightening. You will see that his newest book, A Good American Family, The Red Scare, and My Father, took courage to write and to research. Before we welcome him to the podium, David will be available at the table in the hallway to sign books after the meeting and to answer any questions that you might have. And we want to thank David for donating a portion of the proceeds of to our Madison Rotary Foundation. Let's welcome David to the podium.
In the end, this story is a love story to Madison. But there's a difficult journey before it gets there. In May of 2015, I was at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., starting the research for this book, which is about my father and America during the Red Scare era of the 1950s. My father was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1952 in Detroit, fired from his job, and we were blacklisted for 5 years when our family bounced around America. I had known the shadows of this story before, but in May of 2015, I went to the National Archives to look through the records of the House Un-American Activities Committee, which had been opened only recently before that. And I knew that from the transcript of those hearings in 1952, which had been public record for many years, that my father, when he was called before the committee, wanted to read a statement about what he felt it meant to be an American. And the chairman of the committee said he could not read the statement, but they would file it away. And it was buried at the National Archives and in the records for 6 decades before I got there in 2015. And there was a file that said Elliot Maraniss. And when I opened it up, the first thing I saw was that statement of Elliot Maraniss. My dad was a classic newspaper guy, a really rough and tumble typist, hunt and peck type. And the keys were always sticking, and he was always Xing things out. That's the father I knew. And when I saw that statement, the S in statement jumped up a half space, the way they did on manual typewriters. And it was really only when I saw that, I was in my mid-60s, that for the first time in my life, I actually started to feel what my father must have been enduring during that moment when he was in the crucible, the most difficult period of his life. As I said, it had only been the shadows of our family for all of those years. I'd spent a lot of my career writing biographies of people who were strangers to me when I started, whether it was Barack Obama or Bill Clinton or Vince Lombardi or Roberto Clemente. And they all became familiar to me by the time I was done. And often during that process, people would say, well, why is Barack Obama or Bill Clinton, why are they telling these stories that you find to be not quite accurate? And I'd say, well, all of us pass along the mythology that we hear from our parents and grandparents and the family. And very few of us have a biographer going back to find out what really happened. And I started to think, well, I haven't even done that with my own family. I knew the bare bones of this story of what happened to my father and how it affected all of us. But I thought it was time for me to do it. I wasn't going to write this story while my dad was alive. He had survived that period with incredible strength and optimism and made his way to this city and had a great career here and infused me with all of the journalistic ethics that he had learned from his own experience. Never fall for any rigid ideology. Search for the truth wherever it will take you. All of that was just a shadow of our, the reality of why he learned all those lessons was just a shadow of our lives. So I undertook this most difficult book I'll ever write, and also the most important, I think, that I'll ever write. I started it to try to understand my family, and really ended up not only understanding my family, but a period of American history, and of why I am the way I am, how my parents in that period shaped all of us. My dad was from Brooklyn, from Coney Island. Went to a high school there, Abraham Lincoln High. This was during the depths of the Depression. It was a very progressive school where the principal walked around carrying a pocket edition of Emerson's essays in his back pocket, where the students were inculcated with the idea that they could not be the lost generation of the 20s, that because of the difficulties of the world, they had to try to change it and improve it. Not only was this the Depression, but fascism and Nazism were on the rise in Europe, and America was struggling, as it always has, with racial injustice. And those were really the three central threads that took my father as a young man to the University of Michigan in 1936, and that radicalized him while he was there. He was watching all of these events unfold. He was also a writer. He'd always been a writer, and he became the editorial editor of the Michigan Daily during that period. One of the defining moments of the 20th century was a very underrepresented event, which was the Spanish Civil War. And at the University of Michigan, not only was the labor organizing in Flint and Detroit key and many other issues, but the Spanish Civil War sort of took on the importance that many of the post-war baby boomers in this room would identify with this Vietnam War. And my uncle, my mother's older brother, was at the University of Michigan when my father was there. And in 1937, right after he graduated, he and two of his classmates went to New York, took a boat across the Atlantic, a train across France, and climbed over the Pyrenees Mountains to fight in that Spanish Civil War for what was known as somewhat of a misnomer as the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, which was actually a battalion of the International Brigade. They were fighting against Francisco Franco, who was trying to undo the democratically elected government of Spain, and Franco was being supported by Adolf Hitler and Mussolini. Of the three young men from Michigan who went to fight in that war against fascism, my uncle and one of the others, Elman Service, survived. But one of the three, Ralph Nefas, was captured by Franco's troops, held in a cathedral, which became a prison in Alcanis, and executed. One of my mottos for all of my books is to go there wherever there is. As many of you know, for the Vince Lombardi book, it meant turning to my wife and saying, "How would you like to move to Green Bay for the winter?" Of course, I made it up to her by taking her to Rome for the 1960 Rome book, and Puerto Rico for Clemente, and Vietnam for my Vietnam book, and all over the world. But in this case, let's go to Spain and trace my uncle's route. in that war. And I have to say that, there are moments in my career where history compresses, and I feel the reality of what I'm writing about from long ago. And when we drove into Alcanis, this town in Aragon, and went up to the top of the hill and saw the cathedral, and walked into that cathedral where one of the Michigan young men was held and executed, all of these many decades later, it still felt like a dungeon of death. And it permeated everything that I would write about in this book, trying to understand the 20th century. Because in that war in Spain, all of the isms of that century were at play. Fascism, communism, anarchism, liberalism, all of them, conservatism, all of them were Catholicism, all of them in the mix of that one war. My uncle, Bob Cummins, survived. He and Elman Service, the other one who survived, went back to the University of Michigan, to Ann Arbor. 600 students came out to the student union to welcome them home. Covering the event for the Michigan Daily was the editorial editor of the newspaper, my father, Elliot Maraniss. And among those in attendance was Bob Cummins' younger sister, Mary Cummins, who was my mother. And that's where my parents met, at that very meeting of the Spanish Civil War. And so that's really sort of the genesis of everything that was to follow. My father, after graduating from Michigan in a very tumultuous period at Michigan, and I have to say that part of the difficulty of this book was dealing with the reality of a father that I loved dearly. And it was at Michigan that he became interested in communism. And it was at Michigan in 1939 that he wrote many editorials that were at once evocative of his writing ability and thinking ability, and also made me shake my head and say, Dad, what were you thinking? Including the defense of the Soviet Nazi pact in 1939, which is basically indefensible. In any case, he went through that period, and as soon as Pearl Harbor happened, he enlisted in the Army. He was already known as a radical, and many of the leftists of that period were put into isolated posts during World War II by the military. My father was actually investigated by military intelligence, one of the many sheafs of documents that I got through a Freedom of Information Act request for his FBI file. But in 1944, late 44, he was able to get through officer training school and was put in charge of an all-black unit in World War II. Now, America was openly racist then, segregated. The military was segregated as late as World War II. And the officers of black units tended to be one of two types, either Southern white racists, because the military figured they dealt with African Americans before and knew how to do it in their own way, or Northern radicals who wanted those jobs, or at least didn't mind getting assigned to be the officer of an all-black unit, whereas many white officers thought that was a dead end. So my father was assigned to organize and lead a unit in World War II in 1944 and early 1945. And among the many documents that I was able to get in the research for this book, and I used the same methodology for this book as I would for any of my books. Go there, get the documents, interview as many people as you can, and look to break through the mythology. So among the documents were 100 letters that my father wrote to my mother as he was training and leading this company at Camp Lee, Virginia, in the segregated South, preparing these young men to go over to Okinawa. And of course, this is a very difficult, complicated situation. Here he was, a white officer, trying to lead young American men who were being asked to fight for democracy and liberty in a country that treated them as second-class citizens. And my father understood that. And you see in his letters the depth with which he understood that hypocrisy and complication and how he was trying to make those young men feel that they were getting a square shake from him. And really, in all of my writing, in my son Andrew's writing, in my father's writing, race is at the center of what we do. And I started, when I read those letters, understood why that was, and the beginnings of that from my father when he was leading that company. He came back to Michigan after the war, resumed a job at the Detroit Times, where he was the ace rewrite man, until 1952, when HUAC came to Detroit to try to undo the left wing of the labor movement of the United Auto Workers. And as part of that process, they had an informant who had joined the Communist Party in Michigan in 1944, a woman who later became known as the grandmother spy. And for 8-9 years, she worked in the Communist Party, informing for the FBI, being paid to do that. And she came in from the cold for those hearings in February and March of 1952. For the first time, she testified. She was called the grandmother spy because she was almost 50 years old and was a grandmother, a working class woman from Detroit. And she named hundreds of names during those hearings, one of whom was Elliot Maraniss, my dad. As soon as she testified the very afternoon, the FBI came to the Detroit Times, issued my father a subpoena. He was fired from his job, summarily fired. I was 2 years old, not quite 3. I have no memory of that incident. But I do have, deep in my psyche, sort of a sensibility that was shaped by everything before that and what was to follow. My father was fired. We moved to Brooklyn to live with his parents in a small apartment in Coney Island. He found a job on a newspaper there that folded a month after he got the job. We moved back to Ann Arbor to live with my mother's parents, again in a small house. I was the youngest of 3 kids at that point, all jammed into this house. Then my father got a job at the Cleveland Plain Dealer until the FBI came shortly thereafter and told the publisher that you'd hired a former communist, and he was fired from that job. We moved back to Detroit. My dad, for about 1.5 years, was unbelievably trying to make a living selling party favors for picnics. Anybody who knows my dad knows that would be a disaster. We lived in Detroit for about 1.5 years again, until he was hired to be the editor of a strike newspaper in the Quint Cities of Iowa and Illinois called Labor's Daily. And it was a group of people who bounced around and had troubles in their lives. But my dad was a fabulous editor, sort of a natural-born writer and newspaper man. And he was able to put together this really interesting newspaper with no budget and a small staff. And one of the things that paper did was every couple of weeks, they ran a column called Hello, Wisconsin, written by William T. Evu, the founder and publisher of the Capital Times. This is 1956 into early 57. And Evu saw this paper and said, "Who's putting this out? This looks better than our paper." Because my dad, he knew how to make a newspaper look really neat. He was a great headline writer. My favorite of his headlines of all time was when Bing Crosby died. This was at the Cap Times. And he wrote, "Bing dies at 74, 2 over par." He died on a golf course. Par was 72. Not only for golf, but for the average age of a man at that period. So anyway, Evu saw this interesting little paper. Who's putting it out? Right at that moment, the strike paper was basically dying. So Evie brought my father up to Madison and hired him in the summer of 1957. We moved to a house on Chandler Street near the zoo. I was afraid that I was going to get eaten by a lion or tiger as I walked through those bushes on the way to Vilas Park. The Braves were on their way to winning the World Series. My older siblings and I were getting ready to go to Randall School, and life seemed wonderful. And Madison saved us. And that's the story of this book. Thank you very much.
David, thank you for that great presentation. Again, David will be available in the hall for if you have any questions, and we are adjourned.